Good day, class. Yesterday, power of the media and how they can frame certain events. So the question that I have for you today is, how do you know if the media is telling the truth? How do you know if you watch TV or read the papers or go online, you know what you're reading or seeing is true? Is it always true? Is Fox News always right in their idea of an event, or MSNBC, or Salon, The Atlantic? Is the media completely unbiased? By now you should know the answer to these questions, and we're going to uncover some tricks that the media uses and campaigns use as well to further their agendas. Yes, the media, people who report the news, have an agenda, believe it or not. And we're going to show you some of those things today, and just how easy it is for them to take events and misconstrue them in a way that furthers their agenda. So, one way the media does this is by using sound bites. Sound bites are quotes or recordings that are edited to create a story. Election campaigns will also do the same. Sound bites often completely lack context, and this has gotten worse over the course of a few years. And I'm going to show you a couple sound bites, so don't worry. But, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, sound bites used to be 2-3 minutes long. Now they're oftentimes 10 seconds long. Sound bites reveal the bias of the particular media company that's giving them. There's a couple other ways that the media uses sound bites. I've kind of given them here. There's ad hominem, which means to the man, and that's kind of ascribing someone's a characteristic, or trying to say that someone's not credible to give a view on a certain subject because they don't have a PhD. Well, it doesn't mean that their argument doesn't make sense. The media can overgeneralize facts. They can apply facts to everyone that only were intended for a small group of people. They can overstate the facts as well. They can rewrite history by saying that an event happened at a certain time, or they can say that someone's views don't matter because they are guilty by association. For example, this was something that happened to President Truman. He one time, filled out a card for the KKK. So during his election campaign in 1948, the Republican Party at the time was really keen to say, well, he's a member of the KKK, which even at that time was seen to some degree as a hate group. And that simply wasn't the case. So it's simply, he said, all right, well, he filled out this form once. That means he's a member. It means he's got these radical views. Don't elect him. So all these tactics are done to get people to believe certain things about whether law is good or bad, an agenda is good or bad. And this is done on a range of topics. We're going to look at two. We're going to look at the Affordable Care Act and gun control. And it's clear to note that both sides do this. Both sides of any argument will misconstrue the facts to reveal their agenda. It doesn't mean their agenda is bad. It doesn't mean that they don't have good arguments. However, they discredit someone's thoughts by misconstruing the facts, or by overgeneralizing, or more or less by not being honest. So let's take a look at a couple of these and just see how people, both politicians or elected officials and the media, refight some things or rewrite some things to further their agenda. So the first is from the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. And in this speech, you're going to see President Obama. The context is he's answering a question about whether the Supreme Court was going to strike down the law. So this is last year, 2013. And you have to listen to what he says and think about what we know about the Supreme Court. So in just so you know, the Supreme Court upheld one part of the Affordable Care Act, which was that everyone had to have insurance. So the Supreme Court actually did uphold that part. The second is on gun control. After Sandy Hook Elementary last year, there was a flurry of legislation coming in both at the state and a federal level to pass new measures of gun control. And the National Rifle Association, predictably, was against many of these new measures of gun control that include things like background checks, gun registry, limiting certain guns. But they also suggested that if police officers have...
Ultimately, I'm confident that the Supreme Court will not take what would be an unprecedented, extraordinary step of overturning a law that was passed by a strong majority of a democratically elected Congress.
During his appearance on Meet the Press on Sunday, NRA Chief Wayne LaPierre said, "Call me crazy." Okay, sir, you are crazy.
If it's crazy to call for putting police and armed security in our school to protect our children, then call me crazy.
So, in the first example, obviously, as we learned, the Supreme Court's job is to strike down any laws of government or actions of government that violate the Constitution. So, of course, there's precedent to do that. And then, secondly, that was the second example of gun control was a good example of, a Wayne LaPierre was a good example of a soundbite. So obviously it was a couple sentences, and they're like, all right, you're crazy. So to some degree, that clip itself was a soundbite because it didn't go on to further the whole story. But obviously you could probably guess from the agenda and the whole what they were soundbiting was that they were, generally speaking, going after Wayne LaPierre for his views. So what I want you to do is it's really important to, whenever you're gathering news, to get it from multiple sources. Don't just rely on one source, one page. If you're liberal, check out conservative sources. If you're conservative, check out liberal sources. It's real easy to get stuck in a vacuum and listen to only what your side has to say. And the problem with that is you're only hearing one side of the story. You're not getting the full facts. And as we learned yesterday with Columbine, for example, the media sometimes doesn't always portray the full facts. And as we're learning today, they sometimes have an agenda that they want you to believe that's just not true. And this happens on a range of issues. And it's really easy for the media to do. And the best way you can be aware of it is by studying how the media does it. So let's take a look at the Gettysburg Address, which I went over a couple lessons ago. I kind of was showing you this in the election process campaign, where I gave you the Lincoln's Gettysburg Address was to some degree taken out of context. But let's take a look at this a little bit further to identify the full context. So just to give you some background, the Gettysburg Address was made on November 19th of 1963. It was a memorial service for the 60,000 Union and Confederate soldiers killed there in July of that year. Just to give you the context of what was going on in Gettysburg at that time, more or less, Gettysburg was a small town in south central Pennsylvania that, from the day the Confederate Army arrived, pretty much had its history changed forever. Not only did they have to deal with the Battle of Gettysburg itself in July, but they also had to deal with the aftermath. So they traded a battle and peace to having to deal with bodies all over the place. They had to deal with bodies sticking out of the ground, bodies decomposing, horses decomposing. They more or less traded peace and the smell of rotten flesh to the smell of burning flesh, because one of the suggestions was to start burning all the horses and bodies. So at this time, 4 months later, the effects of the battle were still very real. No one really had been buried, and there was the goal to actually create this as a memorial and to create a burial ground. Lincoln was invited to give this speech. At this time, it was simply just it was a state function, and it really wasn't, it was kind of unexpected to have any federal official come and speak, but the fact that Lincoln wanted to come speak showed that he thought it was very, very important. You also have to remember that this was the president in war, and therefore he had to travel with security. He had to travel with the army. It wasn't exactly easy for him to get to Gettysburg. Even though if you were to drive from Gettysburg to D.C. right now, it might take you 2.5 hours. It took him over 6 hours by train. And that's because he had to go through multiple stops and multiple security spots. So he really wanted to be there. He really wanted to dedicate this ground and contribute to the memorial service. There were a couple other key speakers there. The main one was Edward Everett, and he spoke for 2 hours. Now, Edward Everett would be akin to maybe a Hillary Clinton or a Colin Powell or a Mitt Romney. He was very well known during the day. He was a Secretary of State at one point. He was a senator from Massachusetts. He was the governor of Massachusetts. He was a congressman. He was a diplomat to England. So he was a very well-known person. It's not like he was just some schmuck that wasn't there. He spoke for 2 hours. However, when he heard Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address, he said to him, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." This is a good point for those of you who have a tendency to be long-winded in your writing, that sometimes simplicity is best, and the idea that the key success to a good speaker, a good orator, a good communicator, and Lincoln certainly was that, is to get to the central idea of an issue as quick as possible. And Lincoln did that in 2 minutes. There's some mythology surrounding the Gettysburg Address, that he wrote it on the train or that he came up with the speech on the spot. No one really knows. There's not enough history. But what we do know is that Lincoln wanted to be there. He had time to write it on the train. He was thinking about it. He made 5 copies. And that this event was very important to him. He even left Mary Todd Lincoln at a time when maybe she needed him, which was, as history tells us, quite often. So it's tough to say where Lincoln came up with this speech, but regardless, it's an important speech. And regardless, it's one of the most enduring speeches of our country. It's now on the north-facing wall of the Lincoln Memorial. And it describes what the Civil War was about. It also describes what our nation was about and what it was founded for. So that's the context of the speech. And I'm going to show you that video again I showed you earlier of this speech being soundbited to make it seem like Lincoln is unelectable, that he shouldn't be elected as president in 1864. Obviously, Lincoln was elected in 1864, and by most accounts, even by most historians' account, he is the country's best president that has ever been around, even higher than George Washington, believe it or not. and some lists. Other lists, George Washington's higher. So let's take a look at the clip, and then we'll read the quote, and then we'll read the address to see how it was butchered.
Has President Lincoln given up? At a speech in Pennsylvania, he even refused to dedicate a battlefield still fresh with the blood of tens of thousands of Union soldiers.
We cannot dedicate. We cannot consecrate. We cannot hallow this ground.
Lincoln believes that America will perish from the earth,
Perish from the earth.
and that our soldiers have died in vain.
Died in vain.
Honestly, Abe, died in vain.
In vain. In vain. In vain. In vain.
Abraham Lincoln, wrong on the war, wrong for the Union. I am George B. McClellan, and I approve this message. Has President
Fact Check is a great place to go see how the media and politicians misconstrue facts about any particular agenda or any particular issue out there in the media, and I would encourage you to go look at it. Obviously, I've taken a couple clips from them today, but you can see on a range of issues from sequestration to climate change to gun control to the debt, to the Affordable Care Act, etc. So go take a look on it. Well, let's take a look at what Lincoln said. I've bolded the key parts, and I'll highlight them. There are some parts are bolded for different reasons, but I especially italicize the parts that bolded and italicized. That's right, that were quoted in the video. So I'll highlight them as we talk. So here's the speech, and then I'll stop when they came across a part that was butchered. So 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or that idea of that nation, or any nation so conceived and dedicated can long endure. In other words, the Civil War is a great test to see whether this idea of liberty and equality can last. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. So Lincoln's saying, hey, we need to dedicate a part of Gettysburg, not all of Gettysburg, as a final resting place for the 60,000 people who gave their lives here. That nation, that the nation of the United States must go on. And he says altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. So in the sense he's saying we need to do this. We need to dedicate this ground. We need to have this service. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. That's what the quote is saying. But clearly Lincoln is saying that while we might not be able to do this, and he's going to go on and explain why, it doesn't mean that there doesn't need to be a need to dedicate the ground for the people who died there. And this is what he says is why he said that the people of the United States, or Lincoln himself, could not dedicate. He said the brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but can never forget what they did here. So he's giving credit to the soldiers of the Union Army, not the Confederate Army, believe it or not, and saying that they were the ones who consecrated it. They were the ones who dedicated this ground. If it weren't for them laying down their lives, there wouldn't be a need to hallow the ground or to consecrate the ground or to dedicate the ground. And he's saying even what we do today here does not compare to what they did 4 months ago. So in conclusion, the media does not always give the facts. It's important to get stories from a variety of sources. the media can inhibit the government when it opposes a government action. And conversely, the media can help the government to advance its goals by hurting the opposition of whatever side it was. So it depends on the bias of the media, it depends on the goals of that media and the agenda of that media company on whether it's going to hurt the government or hinder the government. But ultimately, we as citizens really have to be careful because there's a lot of information out there, and we have to make decisions on who we want to support, what ideas we want to support. The media is trying to frame our ideas. That's their job. That's their goal. They want people to go after certain things. The question is, do you want to go after certain things? And you have to know why or why not. However, sadly, the media cannot be your only source of information.